All right, welcome. I'm recording this again for a second time. I tried really hard to get the video of the pieces of Hamilton music integrated for the online classes. I have not been able to figure it out, so I apologize, and apologize for getting this recording up late. But, so we will use the songs and still use them to set the scene. But this is our week one, our week two lecture on the founding documents. We'll be discussing the founding documents this week. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So we will be discussing the founding documents. Let me see my screen. So you'll be able to, for this week, you'll want to go into week two, founding documents folder. There you'll be able to see our student learning outcomes, your student activities, what you'll need to do this week, which is again, continue to read chapter 1 if you have not. Read Federalist 10 and particularly Federalist 51. You'll see your homework assignment or your discussion board assignment is going to be based on Federalist 51. Watch the lecture and review the supplemental videos that are in the reading and supplemental materials folder and review the slides that I use for this. That's really for, if you want to review the slides, but it's really the slides are there for your quizzes and tests. They're great review items. And then you'll see, and this is for every week, your first discussion board questions will be due on Wednesdays. Of course, I'll give you some leeway in these first couple weeks as we get used to the schedule. So today, as I'm recording this today, it won't always be today when you watch this, but on Wednesdays, you will need to have your first posting on the discussion board, and then your 2 responses to your fellow classmates will be due by Sunday. And the purpose of that is to give time for there to be some actual interaction and discussion amongst colleagues and classmates on that discussion board. So I want you to engage with your classmates. That's what adds some richness to the course. And you can see a link here to that as well, or you can click on the link to the left under lessons, collaboration and discussion board to get to it as well. And then you also have a reading quiz every week that is due on Friday. So Friday by midnight, your reading quiz will be due, and you can find that one right here. This one is a little bit different than the others, since there's not a founding documents quiz, reading quiz, but you'll see it's a pretty quick and easy quiz for this first graded assignment. So let's get into got the reshare here. All right. No, don't mess it up. Stop sharing. Oh, no, I'm not hitting that button. All right. So we're discussing the founding documents. Well, you'll hear me mention these over and over again, and you'll want to go ahead and memorize these founding documents, as you'll see in your quiz at the end of the week. They are the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the Bill of Rights. And that's what we'll be talking about today. These are, as we talked about in our introductory lecture, this is the founding documents create the foundation of the House under which our governing structure operates, and under which our society can freely live and reign. So you have the 3 pillars for the 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judiciary, and the founding documents serves as the foundation of our governing structure. So all these will always have the learning objectives posted right here. And we're using the metaphors of the house here as the founding documents, as the foundation of that house, and then using the musical Hamilton to help us set the stage for what the country was feeling at the time. This first song in the musical Hamilton is really about the individual Hamilton, but it also is very much about the country at the time. Hamilton is an immigrant, as many of these new Americans were. He was full of opportunity and was coming to the country looking for that new opportunity. And it's imbibing that revolutionary spirit. So we are going to try to get rid of this thing. Listen to this first song in the musical, and we'll listen to a couple other tracks that make some other key points as we go through the lecture.
How does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman, dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by providence, impoverished and squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter. By 14, they placed him in charge of a trading charter.
And every day while slaves were being slaughtered and carted away across the waves, he struggled and kept his guard up. Inside he was longing for something to be a part of. The brother was ready to beg, steal, borrow, or barter.
Then a hurricane came and devastation reigned. Our man saw his future dripping down the drain. Put a pencil to his temple, connected it to his brain, and he wrote his first refrain, a testament to his pain. Well, the word got around and said this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came, and the world's gonna know your name. What's your name, man?
Alexander Hamilton. My name is Alexander Hamilton. And there's a million things I haven't done. But just you wait, just you wait.
When he was 10, his father split, full of it, debt-ridden. 2 years later, see Alex and his mother bedridden, half dead, sitting in their own sick, the scent thick. And Alex got better, but his mother went quick.
Moved in with a cousin, the cousin committed suicide. Left him with nothing but ruined pride. Something new inside a voice saying, Alex, you gotta fend for yourself. He started retreating and reading every treatise on the shelf.
There would have been nothing left to do for someone less astute. He would have been dead and destitute without a cent or restitution. Started working, clerking for his late mother's landlord, trading sugar cane and rum and all the things he can't afford. Scamming for every book he can get his hands on, planning for the future. See him now as he stands on the bow of a ship headed for a new land. In New York, you can be a new man.
In New York, you can be a new man. In New York, you can just you man. In New York, you can be a new man. New York, just you wait.
Alexander Hamilton,
Alexander Hamilton,
you're waiting in the wings for you.
waiting in the wings.
if America forgot him.
We fought with him.
Me, I died for him.
Me, I trusted him.
Me, I loved him.
And me, I'm the damn fool that shot him.
There's a million things I haven't done, but just him.
What's your name, man?
Alexander Hamilton.
So in the play and in the story, Alexander Hamilton is arriving into New York Harbor in the mid-1700s. The colonies had been prospering until the king and the parliament had decided to change some of their laws. And this is one of the many sparks that sparks the revolution. Now we have a democratic republic here in the United States. We get the democratic part from Greece. Demos, the people serving, going to Athens city-states and everyone voting. And then the republic comes from Rome, the Roman Republic, where they elected senators to represent the people. So you vote in elections and you vote for representatives. That's our form of government, our democratic republic. And again, our form of government is based on these 5 founding documents you see here again. Now, in 1775, many of the colonies were excited, were full of hope, as Hamilton was when he arrived on the shores of New York City. But there was trepidation and nervousness about Boston was experiencing, and the colony of Massachusetts were experiencing something very different as they were occupied by British troops. They had been begging their other colonies, their sister colonies, to help come to their aid, that the British Crown and the military were taking their rights away, and each of the colonies would be next if they didn't stand up against this kind of tyranny. So the colonies agreed and met under the claims of the begging of John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams and John Hancock, all from Boston, and they convened the Second Continental Congress. There was a First Continental Congress that came together to talk about what the colonies should do. The Second Continental Congress was much more serious. They agreed on 3 things. One, that they would nominate General George Washington. He was a colonel at the time. They would give him the new title of general, and he would take over a new Continental Army and continue to march up to Boston and recruit militiamen along the way. Second, they would send an olive branch petition asking for peace. They would send a letter to the king from the Continental Congress, the representatives of the colonies, telling him that they wanted peace. They did not want the situation in Boston to continue to deteriorate into further war. And they were asking for peace and asking what they needed to do to perpetuate peace. But they didn't expect, most of the delegates did not expect to get a good response from that. And many of the delegates thought it was well past time to be asking for peace. Again, this is in 1775, after the Boston Massacre, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and after the Battle of Bunker Hill. So the fighting is well underway in Boston. The third thing they did is agree to form a committee of some of the prominent members and some less prominent members of the convention to write to the king with a more forceful ask. They didn't quite know what this was, but the committee was going to come up with a follow-up to this olive branch petition, assuming that the king did not accept their offer of peace. What are they going to do next? So some of those folks on that committee, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, end up being the most influential in the writing of what comes out of this committee. Jefferson is chosen to write the first draft, John Adams is from Boston. He's on many other committees, and asked Jefferson to write the first draft of this declaration. Now, Jefferson is very well read and very influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers of Europe, such as John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Calvin. These are Enlightenment thinkers that are thinking a lot about natural rights and how governments, the ideal governments, should be formed. No, none of them had those ideal governments over in Europe, and a lot of them were looking to these new areas, and they were hoping that their governments could form them someday. But Jefferson and others were hoping that some of these new theoretical forms of freedom and kinds of governments could be formed here in this new land. So Jefferson writes a first draft and presents it to Adams and Franklin and the others on this committee, and they are shocked when they read it, because what he writes is a full-throated declaration of independence from England, which they were expecting a rebuke, some strongly worded, a strongly worded letter to the king from the colonies, but no one was really expecting them to upright and just say that we are breaking away from the Empire of England right now. But he laid it out very well and listed out the transgressions of the king and was very convincing. And with the help of Jefferson and Franklin, of Adams and Franklin making edits, they made a presentation to the delegation. The delegation continued to edit the declaration, and ultimately the declaration was signed on the 4th of July or 2nd of July. We celebrate the 4th of July as our Independence Day, as the day that that this document was finally signed and sent off to England. And we're going to watch a video on what you might not know about the Declaration of Independence. Hopefully this works in the recording.
All men are created equal, and they are endowed with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not so fast, Mr. Jefferson. These words from the Declaration of Independence and the facts behind them are well known. In June of 1776, a little more than a year after the war against England began with the shots fired at Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia to discuss American independence. After long debates, a resolution of independence was approved on July 2nd, 1776. America was free, and men like John Adams thought we would celebrate that date forever. But it was 2 days later that the gentlemen in Congress voted to adopt the Declaration of Independence, largely written by Thomas Jefferson, offering all the reasons why the country should be free. More than 235 years later, we celebrate that day as America's birthday. But there are some pieces of the story you may not know. First of all, Thomas Jefferson gets the credit for writing the Declaration, but 5 men had been given the job to come up with a document explaining why America should be independent. Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams were all named first. And it was Adams who suggested that the young and little-known Thomas Jefferson join them, because they needed a man from the influential Virginia delegation, and Adams thought Jefferson was a much better writer than he was. Second, though Jefferson never used footnotes or credited his sources, some of his memorable words and phrases were borrowed from other writers and slightly tweaked. Then Franklin and Adams offered a few suggestions, but the most important change came after the Declaration was turned over to the full Congress. For 2 days, a very unhappy Thomas Jefferson sat and fumed while his words were picked over. In the end, the Congress made a few minor word changes and one big deletion. In the long list of charges that Jefferson made against the King of England, the author of the Declaration had included the idea that George III was responsible for the slave trade and was preventing America from ending slavery. That was not only untrue, but Congress wanted no mention of slavery in the nation's founding document. The reference was cut out before the Declaration was approved and sent to the printer. But it leaves open the hard question: how could the men who were about to sign a document celebrating liberty and equality accept a system in which some people owned others? It is a question that would eventually bring the nation to civil war, and one we can still ask today.
This is the real contradiction of the Declaration of Independence. It is in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence that we see the Declaration, what we still look to, why the Declaration is still one of the founding documents, is not for all the reasons that we left England, is that it's for the declaration of the American values found in the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed with their creator with certain inalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the American values that we have tried to live up to. But obviously, even at the very beginning, we're not living up to by keeping this institution of slavery intact, fully intact, while at the same time making this declaration. But when you think of the Declaration of Independence, when it comes to the founding documents, we look to it for the source of American values of freedom, equality, and justice that we are always striving to live up to. So then what? And we got another clip. So what comes next?
They say the price of my war's not a price that they're willing to pay. Insane! You cheat with the French, now I'm fighting with France and with Spain. I'm so blue.
I skipped a whole part there. So we had the Declaration of Independence, and then we had a big war. I forgot that whole part. We fought the Revolutionary War. We miraculously won the Revolutionary War. That was amazingly this small, or not small, but this group of colonies, states beat the largest empire in the world at the time, and won the Revolutionary War. So in the play, that's what just happens. They conclude the Revolutionary War part, and then this is the King of England singing in this part. So what comes next after they had won the Revolutionary War? The states were on their own. They saw themselves as somewhat being on their own. So they went about forming their own state constitutions, and then they agreed to form a loose alliance, a confederacy of states. And this becomes known as, and the document that links them together is known as the Articles of Confederation. This creates a unicameral Congress, a one-house Congress, with equal representation between the states. So each state sends one delegate to the Confederated Congress to help make decisions that impact all of the states. But the states are the primary unit of government. Each state is trying to govern itself and focus on being essentially its own country. And then they have this loose federal government with very little power, no executive branch, just a Congress, and to try to help keep them all together. But ultimately, this confederation was simply too weak, and it soon became apparent over the next 7 to 8 years. It lasted for, I think, 9 years total. But pretty soon, some major flaws became evident. First, the federal government could not collect taxes. There was no mechanism for the federal government to collect taxes. Each individual state could collect taxes, and they individually paid off their own debts. But it was the federal government, it was the Continental Congress that incurred the debts to fight this, the Revolutionary War, to buy the ammunition and military equipment and borrow money from France to be able to fight this war, and they couldn't pay off those debts. So this became a major problem. There was no national currency. Each individual state printed their own money, and this ultimately led to competition between the states. So one state would want their currency to be worth more, so they would print more money. They want to have some more projects, so they would print a bunch more money, and this led to something that we hear a lot about now, inflation. So they had runaway inflation, which devalued their currency and caused all kinds of problems. This unicameral Congress was required by the Articles of Confederation to make decisions unanimously. Each state, because they were equally represented, all had to agree to make any decisions, for this federal government to make any decisions. And as we know, it's very difficult for all of the states to agree on anything. And so very little actually happened because of that requirement for unanimous decision making. There was no mechanism for the federal government to control trade between the states. So the states controlled intrastate commerce, so trade within the state, but interstate commerce, trade between the states, wasn't regulated at all. Because the states acted as if they were their own countries. So they increased tariffs. Some of the states would put a tariff on another state, saying that if you wanted to buy grain from that other state, you had to pay a high tax because they wanted to protect their farmers or their fisheries off the coast. And so this hurt commerce and wasn't helping the economy. It was actually hurting the economy. And of course, there was no coordinated foreign affairs. They were each acting in their own best interests, and they had significant interests. The northern states had closer ties with France, whereas the southern states had closer ties with England. And England and France were at war with each other at the time. So this was creating the possibility of pulling the country back into war, this fledgling country back into war. So for all those reasons, and then ultimately there was also a rebellion of farmers up in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion, because a bunch of farmers that were former soldiers had not gotten paid, but the debt to them had not been paid, but they were being put in jail and required to pay the debts that they were being incurred from the state and from creditors. So they were rebelling against those creditors and against the state and taking over courthouses. Something like 30% of farmers were being taken to court for debts that they had not paid. So this was a major spark of bringing the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. George Washington was very worried about this rebellion that was happening up in Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays. And ultimately, it was two names that you'll hear over and over again during this period, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, that convinced Washington to come out of retirement and help bring all of the delegates, bring representatives from all of the states back together to have another constitutional convention to rethink the Articles of Confederation and to amend them at first, but it quickly became clear that they needed to not just amend them, but they needed to start and write a whole new document from whole cloth. So this happens in the summer of 1787. They bring delegates from all of the colonies to Philadelphia. They meet in secret with George Washington as the presiding officer, as the president of the Senate, and they begin to debate. what another better, what they say in the Constitution, a more perfect union could be, something better than the Articles of Confederation. And of course, next week we'll talk much more specifically about the Constitution, but some of the major debates that were very heated was over representation in this new Congress, the equal representation that was happening in the Confederated Congress had its problems, but it helped the small states because they had the same representation as the states with very large populations. But of course, the states with large populations wanted to have a larger influence in this federal government. They had more people, so they assumed that they should have more votes. Of course, this fight over should the federal government be, they knew they needed a stronger federal government, but how strong should this federal government be? They didn't want it to be as strong as the King of England, but it needed to be stronger than the Articles of Confederation. And so where in between that space would this new federal government land? And then of course there was the issue of slavery in the southern plantation states that those states and their economies were dependent on and were not willing to give up. So there were compromises made, and again, we'll talk about that next week, but ultimately on September 17th, 1787, the delegates, or 35 of the 55 delegates, many left, couldn't stay the whole time. 35 of the original 55 ended up signing the Constitution, even though there were some that were refused to sign, mostly over the lack of a Bill of Rights. And one of the compromises was that they would get that in this first Congress. But it starts with this U.S. Constitution starts with the phrase, "We the people." How do they get the authority to say "we the people"? It's from that ratification process from Article 5 in the U.S. Constitution, that it must go and be ratified by 3/4 of the delegates of the states, so that all the people, at least all the people that were eligible to vote, which is mostly landowning men at the time, landowning white men at the time, would have to approve of this Constitution being the new law of the land. But again, we will cover the Constitution more next week. So the delegates sign the document, and then they go off to their states to start to make the case for this new Constitution, to convince the prominent people, the landowners in their states, that they need to vote for this Constitution, elect delegates to their state conventions, and ratify this new Constitution. Again, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison come up with the idea, along with John Jay, of writing op-eds. So basically letters to newspapers, to prominent newspapers throughout the country. They would send it to one newspaper, then it would be reprinted in many newspapers, and then after they were all printed, they were bound together in books and sold as books throughout the country. It was the bestseller of the day, and these Federalist Papers, as they became known, because they were arguing for the passage of the Constitution. So they were the Federalists, those that were arguing against the Constitution during or those that were worried about the strength of the federal government during these debates became known as the Anti-Federalists, that wanted a weaker federal government. So the Federalist Papers, those that were arguing for this Constitution as it was written, with a fairly strong federal government, these papers gave the context of what happened in the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution itself is a fairly bland document. It says that there will be 3 branches of government. The president nominates ambassadors and judges, but it doesn't say why any of that stuff happens. That is what's in the Federalist Papers. That's why judges use the Federalist Papers still to this day in court rulings. So yeah, there ended up being 85 essays total. Hamilton writes the majority of them, and they get printed, and they're signed Publius. They're anonymous. no one knows at the time who wrote these Federalist Papers, because they're signed "The People" Publius, because the authors wanted it to seem as if these were written by, for and by the people. But today historians have figured out who wrote which of the Federalist Papers, and there's two in particular that we want to point to and that are important for the structure of our government and going forward. First is Federalist 10, which we think was written by James Madison. It identifies, and he talks a lot about their concern about factions. They knew that there would be groups of people that would come together to try to get their policy preferences put forward within this new form of government. And they wanted to make sure that one group of people couldn't come to dominate another group of people. Particularly a minority group of people could not come to dominate a majority of the people. So Madison talks about in Federalist 10 all the ways that this new document, that this new U.S. Constitution will stop any factions of people from coming together to dominate this new form of government. He also talks about, and what these factions, what we know these factions to be, he was absolutely right. This is just human nature, that people form together in like-minded groups, and these like-minded groups will become very powerful and very dominant in a political structure such as this. And what he was predicting at the time was political parties. They knew that political parties would form. What they didn't know at the time was that the system that they had created ultimately made it so that we inevitably would have two dominant political parties. They couldn't have predicted that the way our elections were set up and the way that states run elections, the way that we have single member districts and majority winner take all or first past the post elections, make it so that there would inevitably be two dominant parties. He also talks a lot about the difference between why this Constitution is a republic, why we focus on being a republic, that in a pure democracy, you will not, in a country as large as the United States, you can't have a pure democracy. It just wouldn't make sense for everyone to be able to vote. And so that we must have a republic, but we must have districts in that republic that are small enough that your representatives can get to know you. So he advocated very strongly in Federalist 10, as well as in one of the original amendments to the Constitution, that congressional districts needed to be small enough so that members of Congress could really get to know and well represent their members of Congress. Their constituents. The other, so that was Federalist 10. Federalist 51, we think is written by Alexander Hamilton, and it really focuses on the importance of separation of powers, which as well, Federalist 10 talks about separation of powers as well, in how we diffuse the influence of factions. Hamilton continues on talking about the importance of the separation of the three branches, how important that is, and how that division of labor between the three branches and even between state and federal government is essential to a well-founded democracy. It says in Federalist 51, if men were angels, then no government would be necessary. And this is true. It is human nature to want to dominate other humans. And if there were no government, then in most other societies, then you have a strong man controlling the weak and the like. And that happens in government if you don't put checks and balances in place to make sure that a strong man in government can't control the other factions of government, that you don't have a strong minority faction taking over the Congress and dominating the judiciary and the executive, or you don't have a strongman president leading the executive that then dominates the legislative and judicial branches. But the branches are completely dependent upon each other so that one branch can't dominate the others. So those Federalist Papers go out and they are successful. The states go about ratifying the Constitution. North Carolina is one of the last states to ratify the Constitution. It's actually, North Carolina doesn't ratify until it already becomes the law of the land. Here in North Carolina, only 3/4 of the states had to vote for ratification for it to become the law in all of the states. But about 6 months after North Carolina got on board. So the Constitution becomes the law of the land. The states go about electing their delegates, their representatives, and they come to what is then the capital, New York City, and the first Congress meets. They also have, the states have their first electoral college votes, and George Washington is elected unanimously as the first president. In that first meeting of Congress, because of the ending of the 1787 Constitutional Convention, the worries that some of those delegates that left and didn't sign the Constitution had, that there was no Declaration of Rights. Many of the state constitutions, including North Carolina's, begin with a Declaration of Rights, saying that these are the rights that people have and the protections that they have from the government. And the reason being is that that's really the purpose. They wanted to state right up front, this is the reason that we have a government in the first place, is to protect the rights of the people, so that we don't have a king or an autocrat or a strongman taking over. We want to create a government so that there is freedom, equality, and justice for all the people of the land. The U.S. Constitution didn't have that. It basically just said we will create this government. When they left in 1787, they ultimately said, in general, we agree, but we want to get out of here and we want to get this thing started. But the first act that we will do when we get back, when the new Congress is in place, is put towards the states the first amendments to the Constitution. So what we know now as the Bill of Rights are 10 of the first 12 amendments that are passed in Congress. In the first days that this Congress comes together, they pass 12 amendments to make those first changes to the Constitution. 10 of those are what we now know as the U.S., as the Bill of Rights. People always ask what the other two were. One of them was to keep congressional districts sufficiently small. I don't know what the wording of it was, but this is the one that was not ratified by the states. It said something along the lines of that congressional districts will remain sufficiently small so that a member of Congress will be able to get there, on a horse ride or something along those lines. Some way of saying that that will keep congressional districts small. And that was not ratified by the states, and we now have a cap of the number of members of Congress at 435. So those congressional districts actually keep on getting bigger every 10 years when we do the census, because there's the capped number and the population continues to grow. The other one that was not ratified was blocking Congress from increasing their own pay. So they could increase the pay of members of Congress, but they couldn't increase their own pay. They could only increase the pay of the next folks, the next group of people that were elected. And that ended up being ratified later in the 1980s, in the late 80s or early 90s. That's the last amendment to the Constitution. That's the 27th Amendment. So yeah, those are the other two. But so the 10 that were ratified by the states, and those were actually the first two. So people always say that the First Amendment is the most important amendment because it was put forward first. And that's actually not true. Those other two were actually the first two amendments that were passed by Congress. The First Amendment was actually the Third Amendment passed by Congress. So of course you have the freedom of speech, press and religion, as well as assembly and petition. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment, which doesn't really apply to you anymore because we don't, the federal government doesn't try to put troops in your home. But we're actually gonna, instead of me just walking through them, we're gonna watch a video that does a quick overview. And again, we're gonna be talking much more about these next week and throughout the semester. But here is a quick overview of the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights.
The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, also known as the Bill of Rights, were ratified or passed over 200 years ago. But even though they're a bit, well, old, these first 10 amendments are still the most debated and discussed section of our Constitution today. So can you remember what they are? Let's take a look. The First Amendment is the freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. This may be the most revered of the amendments. The First Amendment protects our rights to say and write our opinions, worship how we please, assemble together peacefully, and petition our government if we feel the need. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. The original intent of the Second Amendment was to protect colonists from the invading British soldiers, but it now guarantees that you have the right to own a gun to defend yourself and your property. The Third Amendment is called the Quartering Amendment. It was written in response to the British occupation and as a result of the colonists having to house or quarter soldiers in their homes during the American Revolution. Because of this amendment, our government can never force us to house soldiers in our home. The Fourth Amendment is the right to search and seizure. The police can't come into our home without a search warrant and take our personal property. Today, many concerns have arisen about our rights to privacy and technology. For example, can the government track your location with your smartphone, or can social media postings such as on Facebook and Twitter be used without a warrant? On to the fifth. It's all about due process. You've probably heard the phrase, "I plead the fifth," in movies or on TV. They're talking about the Fifth Amendment, which says that you don't have to take the witness stand against yourself if you may end up incriminating yourself. Okay, we're halfway done. The Sixth and Seventh Amendments are about how the legal system works. If you're accused of a crime, you have the right to a speedy public trial and an impartial jury. You also have the right to a lawyer and the right to take the stand if you choose. This is important because it will prevent the accused from sitting in prison forever and insists that the prosecution proceed with undue delay. The seventh says you have the right to a jury trial where 12 impartial peers decide your innocence or guilt in the courtroom as opposed to a judge doing it all alone. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Is a death penalty cruel? Is it unusual? It's hard for Americans to agree on the definitions of cruel and unusual. The Ninth and 10th Amendments are called the non-rights amendments. They say that the rights not listed in the Bill of Rights are retained by the people in the states. You have other rights that are not listed in the Constitution, and the states have the right to make their own policies, like instituting state taxes. So, now you know all 10 amendments. Can you remember them all? If not, remember this. The Bill of Rights are a crucial piece of American history, and though society has undergone many changes these past 200 and some years, the interpretation and application of these amendments are as vital today as they were when they were written.
So again, we'll discuss those, the Bill of Rights more next week, and we'll be discussing those individual rights throughout the semester in various sections. When we're talking about courts, when we're talking about civil rights, civil liberties, we'll be touching on each of them in more depth. So in general, again, going back to where we started, the founding documents are the foundation of our governing structure, of our governing system. They outlined how our government works and how our society can operate freely and with equality and justice. And again, Remember what they are: the Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the Bill of Rights. And next week, in our next module, we will dive deeper into the U.S. Constitution and go from there. So, as always, look forward to seeing you in the discussion board. Let me know what questions you have, and we'll see you guys soon. Thank you.